Hello everyone, and welcome back to VintageSpur. I know many of you tune into these videos to relax or fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from tonight. It's always so amazing to see how far these stories travel across the world. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying ASMR scary stories for sleep. It helps keep the stories coming. Now, let's settle in. The town of Alder Hollow was a quiet place, nestled between rolling hills and dense ancient forests. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at an unhurried pace. But there was one place that everyone in Alder Hollow avoided: the Whispering Woods. The forest stretched endlessly to the west of the town, its towering trees forming a near impenetrable canopy that blocked out the sun even on the brightest days. Legends surrounded the woods, passed down through generations. People spoke of voices that could be heard among the trees, whispers carried on the wind that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. No one who had ventured too deep into the Whispering Woods ever returned. Despite the warnings, teenagers in Alder Hollow often dared each other to step just inside the tree line. Most would run back out laughing, swearing they heard faint murmurs, but none dared to go farther. None, that is, until Clara. Clara was new to Alder Hollow. She had moved to the town with her father after her mother's death, and though she tried to fit in, she remained an outsider. Her classmates whispered about her in hushed tones, speculating about her quiet demeanor and the way she always seemed lost in thought. Clara, for her part, found their gossip tiresome. She preferred to spend her time exploring the outskirts of the town, her sketchbook in hand, drawing the world around her. It was during one of these excursions that Clara first heard the whispers. She was sitting on a fallen log at the edge of the Whispering Woods, sketching the gnarled trees and the way their roots seemed to claw at the earth, when she caught the faintest sound. It was like a breeze rustling the leaves, but layered within it were voices, soft and indistinct. "Hello?" Clara called, standing and peering into the shadows. The whispers stopped. The forest fell silent, unnaturally so. Even the birds and insects seemed to hold their breath. Clara felt a chill crawl up her spine, but she shook it off. The stories about the woods were just that, stories, weren't they? She resolved to return the next day, and the day after that. Each time she ventured a little farther into the forest, sketching the twisted trees and the strange patterns their branches formed against the gray sky. And each time, the whispers grew louder. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest was bathed in twilight, Clara found herself deep within the woods, farther than she had ever gone before. The air was cool and damp, and a thin mist curled around her ankles. She was about to turn back when she saw it. A clearing up ahead, bathed in an eerie silver light. The clearing was unlike anything Clara had ever seen. In its center stood a massive oak tree, its trunk blackened as if by fire. Its branches stretched outward like skeletal arms, and beneath it lay a circle of smooth, white stones. As Clara stepped closer, she noticed markings carved into the stones, symbols that looked ancient and unfamiliar. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a rising wind. This time, they were distinct. Voices overlapped, some pleading, some warning, others laughing in a way that sent shivers down Clara's spine. She clutched her sketchbook tightly, her heart pounding. "Leave!" one voice hissed, low and guttural. "Stay!" another countered, soft and melodic. Clara turned in a circle, trying to pinpoint the source, but the voices came from all directions. She felt dizzy, disoriented, as if the forest itself were closing in on her. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman, her pale skin glowing in the dim light. She wore a tattered dress that seemed to flow like smoke around her, and her eyes were pure black, voids that seemed to pull Clara in. "You shouldn't be here," the woman said, her voice carrying a strange echo. "This place is not for the living." Clara tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. The woman stepped closer, and Clara saw that her feet didn't touch the ground. She hovered just above it, her movements smooth and unnatural. "They've been watching you," the woman continued, gesturing to the trees. Clara followed her gaze and felt her stomach drop. Faces seemed to emerge from the bark, their features contorted in pain. Eyes blinked, mouths moved silently, and then they vanished back into the wood. "Who are you?" Clara finally managed to whisper. The woman tilted her head, a sad smile playing on her lips. "Once, I was like you, curious, foolish, but now I am bound to this place, as you will be if you do not leave." Clara's heart raced. She stumbled back, clutching her sketchbook like a talisman. "I don't understand," she said. "What is this place?" The woman's expression darkened. "It is a gateway," she said, "a threshold between worlds. The spirits here are restless, trapped. They feed on the living, drawing them in with whispers and shadows. You must go before it's too late." But even as the woman spoke, Clara felt something pulling at her. It was a strange magnetic force, tugging at her very being. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices urging her to stay, to join them. The mist thickened, curling around her legs and climbing higher, cold and damp against her skin. "Run!" the woman said, her voice sharp and urgent. "Run, and do not look back." Clara didn't need to be told twice. She turned and fled, her feet pounding against the forest floor. The whispers followed her, rising to a deafening roar. The trees seemed to close in, their branches clawing at her like skeletal hands. She tripped and fell, her sketchbook flying from her grasp. Scrambling to her feet, she grabbed it and kept running, her lungs burning and her heart hammering in her chest. At last, she burst through the tree line and into the open air. The whispers stopped abruptly, and the oppressive weight lifted from her chest. Clara collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. She looked back at the forest, half expecting to see the woman, or the faces in the trees, but there was nothing. Just the silent, shadowy woods. Clara never returned to the Whispering Woods. She told no one what had happened, but the sketches in her book told the story for her. They grew darker, more disturbing, filled with twisted trees and ghostly figures. And though she tried to move on, she couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't done with her. Late at night, as she lay in bed, she could still hear them. The whispers, calling her name. It was a crisp autumn evening when Daniel found himself at the old Maple Hollow train station. The platform was deserted, the air heavy with the scent of damp leaves and rusted metal. Daniel's breath puffed out in white clouds as he paced back and forth, his suitcase in hand. He hadn't planned on being here. The station was rarely used anymore. The trains long since rerouted to the newer station in town. But a strange letter had arrived that morning, instructing him to catch the midnight train from Maple Hollow if he wanted answers about his missing sister, Lily. Lily had vanished 3 years ago, her disappearance leaving the family fractured and desperate. No leads, no clues, just gone. So, when the letter arrived, Daniel didn't hesitate. He had to know, even if it meant following a cryptic note to a forgotten station in the dead of night. The clock on the platform struck midnight, its chimes echoing into the stillness. Daniel's pulse quickened. He scanned the tracks, expecting silence, but then he heard it. The faint, rhythmic clatter of an approaching train. A cold wind swept through the station, carrying with it a low, mournful whistle. The train emerged from the darkness, its sleek black engine gleaming in the dim light of the platform lamps. It looked old but well-maintained, its windows glowing with a soft, golden light. As it came to a stop, Daniel noticed the insignia on the side of the engine, a silver crescent moon encircled by intricate patterns. The doors slid open with a hiss and warm air rushed out, carrying the faint scent of lavender and something metallic. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before stepping aboard. The interior was unlike any train he had ever seen. The walls were paneled in dark wood, and the seats were upholstered in rich burgundy velvet. Brass fixtures gleamed in the lamplight, and a soft, haunting melody played from somewhere unseen. The train was empty, save for a conductor standing at the far end of the car. He was tall and gaunt, his uniform immaculate but strangely old-fashioned. His eyes, a piercing gray, seemed to look straight through Daniel. "Ticket, please," the conductor said, his voice low and resonant. Daniel fumbled in his pocket and pulled out the letter. The conductor took it, examined it closely, and gave a curt nod. "Welcome aboard the midnight train," he said. "Your journey begins now." Before Daniel could ask what that meant, the conductor disappeared into the next car, leaving him alone. The train lurched forward, and the lights outside the window blurred into streaks of gold and black. Daniel took a seat by the window, clutching his suitcase tightly. The train moved swiftly, but the landscape outside was strange. Instead of the familiar countryside, Daniel saw a shifting panorama of desolate fields, shadowy forests, and eerie, fog-shrouded towns. The sky was an unnatural shade of deep purple, dotted with stars that seemed too bright and too close. Daniel's unease grew with each passing minute. He glanced around the car, half expecting someone to appear, but it remained empty. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A shadow flickered across the opposite wall, darting from one end of the car to the other. "Hello?" Daniel called, his voice echoing in the stillness. No response. The shadow flickered again, this time closer. Daniel's grip on his suitcase tightened as he stood and moved toward the door leading to the next car. He hesitated before sliding it open, the soft melody growing louder as he stepped through. The next car was identical to the first, but this one wasn't empty. A woman sat in the far corner, her head bowed as she cradled something in her hands. Her hair was long and dark, obscuring her face. Daniel approached cautiously. "Excuse me," he said. Are you waiting for someone?" The woman's head snapped up, and Daniel recoiled. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken and rimmed with darkness. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Only a low, guttural moan. Daniel stumbled back, his heart racing, as the woman's form dissolved into a swirl of shadow and vanished. Daniel's breathing was ragged as he backed into the nearest seat. The melody shifted, becoming more discordant, and the train's lights flickered. The air grew colder, and frost crept along the windows. Daniel wanted to leave, to escape, but the train showed no signs of stopping. As he sat there, trembling, the conductor reappeared. His expression was unchanged, but there was something menacing in the way he loomed over Daniel. "The midnight train shows you what you seek," the conductor said. "But beware, the truth is not always kind." "What truth?" Daniel demanded. "What does this have to do with my sister?" The conductor gestured to the next car. "The answers lie ahead, but once you see them, there is no turning back." Daniel hesitated, then stood. He wasn't sure if it was courage or desperation that drove him forward, but he couldn't stop now. He pushed open the door to the next car and stepped inside. This car was different. The walls were lined with mirrors, their surfaces warped and clouded. As Daniel walked down the aisle, the reflections twisted and shifted, showing glimpses of scenes he couldn't fully comprehend. A darkened room, a figure in the shadows, a girl crying out in fear. At the end of the car was a single door, its frame etched with the same crescent moon insignia. Daniel reached for the handle, his hand trembling, and pushed it open. The final car was empty except for a single figure standing in the center. It was Lily. Her clothes were tattered, her face pale, but her eyes were the same as he remembered, filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "Lily," Daniel whispered, stepping closer. "Daniel," she said, her voice weak. "You shouldn't have come." "What happened to you?" he asked, tears streaming down his face. "Where have you been?" Lily shook her head. "I can't leave. Neither can you now. The train, it takes us. It keeps us." Before Daniel could respond, the car began to dissolve into darkness. The walls, the floor, even Lily, all of it faded, leaving Daniel standing in an endless void. The whispers began, soft at first, then growing louder, echoing all around him. The last thing Daniel saw before the darkness consumed him was the conductor, his gray eyes glinting like steel. "Welcome to the midnight train," the conductor said. "Your journey has just begun." In the remote hills of the countryside stood an inn that time had forgotten. The Raven's Hollow Inn, as it was called, was nestled deep in a foggy valley, its weathered wooden exterior barely visible from the winding road that led to it. The locals whispered of strange happenings there, of guests who checked in but never checked out. Despite its dark reputation, the inn still stood, its windows glowing faintly in the night like eyes watching from the shadows. Eleanor was a travel writer with a taste for the macabre. She had made a career out of exploring haunted places, documenting the eerie histories of forgotten locations. When she heard of the Raven's Hollow Inn, she knew she had to see it for herself. It was the perfect setting for her next article, and perhaps even her next book. The day she arrived, the weather was dreary. Rain lashed against her car as she navigated the treacherous road leading to the inn. Trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. By the time she pulled into the gravel lot, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the valley cloaked in darkness. The inn's front door creaked open as Eleanor stepped onto the porch. The lobby was dimly lit, the faint scent of mildew and old wood filling the air. A tall, wiry man stood behind the reception desk, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. "You must be Miss Price," the man said, his voice smooth but unsettling. "Welcome to the Ravens Hollow Inn. I'm Ezra, the caretaker." Eleanor forced a smile. "Thank you. I'm here to stay the night, as arranged." Ezra nodded and handed her a tarnished brass key. "Room 7, top of the stairs, end of the hall. Dinner will be served shortly in the dining room." Eleanor's room was exactly as she had expected, small, musty, and steeped in a sense of foreboding. The wallpaper was peeling, and the bed creaked under the slightest pressure. She placed her bag on the floor and unpacked her camera, notebook, and recorder. The inn was quiet, too quiet. She decided to explore before dinner. The hallways were long and narrow, lined with faded portraits of unsmiling faces. Eleanor's footsteps echoed eerily as she walked. She paused before one painting of a young woman in a dark dress. The woman's eyes seemed to follow her, their gaze unnervingly lifelike. "Beautiful, isn't she?" Ezra's voice startled Eleanor, and she turned to find him standing behind her. "Yes," she said, catching her breath. "Who is she?" Ezra's lips curved into a faint smile. "That's Margot, the inn's first proprietor. They say she still watches over the place." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Watches over it? You mean as a ghost?" Ezra didn't answer. Instead, he tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Eleanor with a chill running down her spine. Dinner was served in a cavernous dining room with a massive stone fireplace. The flames crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Eleanor was the only guest, and the silence was broken only by the sound of her fork on the plate. The food was simple but hearty, though she found herself eating quickly, eager to return to her room. That night, as she lay in bed, Eleanor began to hear noises. At first it was faint, the sound of footsteps pacing in the hallway. Then came the whispers, soft and indistinct, as if several voices were speaking just out of earshot. She grabbed her recorder and notebook, determined to document everything. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The whispers stopped. The room grew colder, and Eleanor could see her breath misting in the air. A low creak came from the corner of the room, and she turned her flashlight toward it. The beam illuminated a figure standing by the wardrobe, a woman in a black dress, her face pale and expressionless. It was Margot, the woman from the portrait. Eleanor froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. The woman raised a hand and pointed toward the door. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone, leaving only the faint scent of lavender in her wake. Shaking, Eleanor grabbed her camera and stepped into the hallway. The air was thick, oppressive, and the whispers had returned, louder now. They seemed to come from all directions, urging her forward. She followed them, her footsteps tentative, until she reached a door at the end of the hall that hadn't been there before. The door was old and cracked, with the same brass crescent moon insignia she had seen on her room key. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor pushed it open. The room beyond was unlike anything in the inn. It was vast, its walls covered in mirrors that reflected an endless void. In the center of the room stood a table, and on it lay a single, leather-bound book. Eleanor approached cautiously, her reflection distorting in the warped mirrors as she moved. The book's cover was engraved with the name Margot in elegant script. She opened it and found page after page of names, each written in a spidery hand. Her own name was there, freshly inked at the bottom of the list. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and the whispers turned into anguished screams. Eleanor spun around, but the room had changed. The mirrors now showed scenes of the past. Guests arriving at the inn, their faces filled with hope and curiosity, only to vanish into shadow. She saw herself, walking into the inn earlier that day, her expression wary but determined. And then she saw Margot, standing behind her in the reflection, her eyes burning with an otherworldly light. "You shouldn't have come here," Margot's voice echoed, low and chilling. "No one leaves Raven's Hollow." The mirrors shattered, and the room plunged into darkness. Eleanor felt a force pulling her, dragging her toward the table. She tried to resist, but it was too strong. The last thing she saw was the book, its pages glowing with an eerie light before everything went black. When morning came, the Raven's Hollow Inn was silent once more. The caretaker tidied the lobby, humming a soft tune. A new name had appeared in the book on the desk, written in the same spidery hand. Eleanor Price. And somewhere deep in the inn, her whispers join the others, calling out to the next unsuspecting guest.